Hey there, that was super smooth, right? Europe's biggest festival on the future is coming to an end, but don't worry, we still have so many reasons for you to stay with us today. I'm Taysir, in case we haven't met before, and today is going to be starting with a geopolitical one-on-one in a minute. We'll also be joined by one of Hungary's top radio hosts to talk about trolling and online harassment. We'll also check out the future of cars and whether or not free will exists at all. But for that, we need you. Tell us in the comments what you think and ask your questions from our masterminds directly on live. Make sure you also check out our future jobs platform at brainbar.com in order to find some really interesting jobs. Also, you can download the Brainbar app to find the most interesting job offers from our partners, and you can get in touch with their HR people directly. Well, are you ready? Let's go into top gear with our first guests.
Welcome back to Brain Bar. It's our last day. I'm exhausted. My name is Sid Murthy. I'll be your host for this next segment. But since it's our last day, we're going to start things off with a very light, easy topic. Let's talk about the decline of the EU. That's something that makes me feel a little bit weird, if I'm honest. I remember in 2002, when the euro came out, everyone was so excited. It was such a great symbol. And then in 2004, Hungary joined the EU, and the whole country was filled with so much energy and optimism. But now here we are, 16 years later, talking about the decline of the EU. I don't really know how to feel about that. But since it's such a spicy topic, the way we're going to talk about it is in the format of Battle of the Minds. That's a debate. So we're going to have two speakers, and it's up to you and the audience to decide who wins, who's the most compelling speaker. So in the left corner, we have a Hungarian economist. He's the best-selling author of 6 books, and he's a regular commenter on the EU. In the right corner, we have a Belgian historian. He's an expert on the Roman Empire, and he's the author of The Decline. So please join me in welcoming my guests, Dr. David Engels and Dr. Zoltan Pogatsa. Gentlemen, can you see me?
Yes, fine. Thank you.
How are you doing?
Very good.
Very
Great.
good.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with an easy question. Is the EU a good thing? Dr. Engels, why don't you start us off?
A good thing. Well, on an economic level, certainly. I'm a Belgian, German-speaking Belgian, and I saw that the opening of the border, for example, from Belgium to Germany was really an excellent thing. So, in principle, yes. But what I think is very problematic is that the European Union, for the moment, is adopting more and more internationalist, universalist, multiculturalist ideology, which makes it very difficult for many citizens to identify with Europe itself and not only the world as such. And I think that creates a lot of problems when it comes to assuring solidarity between European citizens.
I agree. I think that the EU...
Well, let's not agree too quickly. This is a battle after all.
I agree that it would be a good thing. I agree for different reasons why it would be a good thing. I think that Europe had a history of dividedness, of wars, and therefore unification is obviously a good thing. It keeps peace in Europe and keeps nations in harmony. My problem is that actually, I think it's the opposite of what you just said. I think that it's too economistic, and it doesn't contain enough culture, democracy, human rights, and the rest of it. So the actual treaties, the way it functions, has too much to do with trade, and it's too dominated by large corporations, and it is not relevant enough for the little people. So there's actually very little in the legal corpus of the EU that ordinary people can relate to.
So will the EU then decline? Is it destined to fail?
I don't think that the European Union is destined to fail. To the contrary, I think rather that the European Union will become more and more important. But I think that in the next 10 or 20 years, we will see a growing paralysis of the European Union. I think that the divides between North, South, East, West, also the battle between more politically correct parties and more populist parties will make it very difficult for the European Union to be present, to be efficient. I think there will be a gradual radicalization also within the European Union, between left and right, you could say. And all this is, of course, not only proper to the European Union, it is also concerning many nation states, if you look at France or Germany, for example. So I think we are going through a period of paralysis, which will lead to growing civil unrest. Look only at the yellow vests in France. And then afterwards, once we are at the bottom, you could say, then there will be something new. But this new thing will most certainly be a reorganization of the European space. That's very certain. But I do not think that it will happen in a very democratic way. I think that in 10, 20 years, the crisis will be such that it will only be, unfortunately, from a very authoritarian point of view, that it will be possible to keep all this together. And that's what I expect, and that's what I fear. So it will not be a decline or fall of the European Union, but we are certainly heading towards something like the decline and fall of our traditional views on democracy, freedom, etc.
Dr. Pogatsa.
Yeah, Sid, you're asking if the EU will be in decline. I actually think that the EU has already been in decline for quite a while. I think the EU actually reached its pinnacle somewhere around the early 1990s. So it's the Treaty of Maastricht, basically, that where the European Union was actually created in 1992, and a lot of the current setup of the EU was created in the early 90s. That's when the pinnacle was reached. And ever since, I think it's been in decline. I mean, the EU wanted to have a constitution, which was rejected. Then you had the crisis with the Eurozone, which deeply divided countries. I think if you look at the Eurobarometer polls, you will find that the Euro is actually very unpopular on the periphery and quite popular in the core. Then you had the migration crisis, which also divided countries, and a number of other issues as well. So actually, it's been in decline. And if you look at the weight of the EU in the global scheme of things, you also see the EU in decline. So you have the Chinese and the Americans basically bottling it out in the global arena, and Europe is relatively insignificant. If you look at it from the Middle East, if you look at it from Africa, from China, Europe is basically an insignificant institution. Other countries tend to deal with European countries individually rather than through Brussels.
Right. Well, I think we've started off in a really spicy way. So audience, click on the link in the comments and get voting. We need to figure out who you find more compelling. So I think we've got some clearly defined viewpoints over here. So you just mentioned Brussels. So do you think essentially does Brussels have too much or too little power? Dr. Engels.
It depends on the point of view. I would say, or I personally, I'm rather in favor of a reconfiguration of the European Union in the sense that Europe certainly needs more cooperation in some fields of action. I would say everything that is absolutely necessary for the survival of the European civilization as a whole, like border control, like the fight against crime, like also some form of legal and of economic cooperation, like research, for example, like also foreign policy, even military. So I'm quite in favor of all that. But I think that on the other hand, there are a lot of competences that could be also be reallocated to the nation states, perhaps even to regions where they would be treated in a much more subsidiary way. Of course, when we speak about regionalism and about the possibility of seeing the concept of the nation state in some way put further or be developed further. I think that we also should speak a lot about the present-day realities of the interactions between big metropolis areas like Paris, for example, or like the Ruhrgebiet, and then these more provincialized, flat country areas which are becoming more and more dissociated in some way with what is actually happening economically, culturally, politically, which is also one of the bases of the protests of the Yellow Vests in France. So I think we need certainly to rethink quite totally how we will organize our European space, but I do not think that everything can be solved on a Brussels level. I think that the Brussels level should contain or should remain competent for a lot of very fundamental issues when it comes to the survival of Europe, but all the rest should certainly be rethought again. But this can only be efficient and successful, and I think that's the real crux of the problem,
Right.
if the European Union once again states its own identity and bases its identity on its cultural specificity, which is very different from the Chinese, the Muslim, the Indian, or otherwise. And I think that is something where the European Union for the moment is struggling very strongly with finding back its way to its own identity, and that's also why, for example, when we had this constitution progress with Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, that this constitution also was not accepted because it didn't really manage to state this identity.
Dr. Pogatsa, before you respond, I just want to check in with the audience. So the first vote is in. So Dr. Engels, you are right now sitting at 33%, and Dr. Pogatsa, you are sitting at 67%. Dr. Engels, you're going to have to pull something out to win back this vote and win this battle. So Dr. Pogatsa, you have the floor.
Right, so I don't disagree with David in that I don't think everything should be at the Brussels level. Obviously, we need subsidiarity in the sense that nation states, cities, and even regions, I agree, should have powers where these powers are relevant. So there are issues where these powers are really relevant at the local level. But at the moment, what actually is the situation is quite contrary to the popular belief that Brussels has too much power. Actually, the only area where Brussels has too much power, I would say, is the economic area. So in terms of competition policy or in terms of taxation and issues like that, Brussels can intervene and does intervene quite regularly. But in terms of most other issues, I think the problem is exactly the opposite. Brussels doesn't have enough power. The case of Hungary, for instance, proves that from the last 10 years. There's nothing that the Hungarian government did in the last 10 years where the EU did and could intervene in an efficient way. I mean, they criticize Hungary in so many ways, but what did they actually achieve? There's actually nothing. It turns out that their competencies are actually quite empty. But there are many other examples as well in terms of how the EU doesn't really have any competencies on the inside, and I would say the same thing about the outside as well. So, as David rightly pointed out, we should have, for instance, common foreign policy. Now, theoretically do, but do countries really think of us as the EU from the outside? I stressed that before. If you look at it from Brazil or from India, you tend to deal with Germany or France or Italy. You don't deal with the EU or only on a secondary level do you deal with them. Also, things like tax evasion. I mean, can the EU actually really do anything efficient against tax evasion? If you decide to take, large corporations or oligarchs, if they decide to take their money to the Bahamas, can the EU actually do anything efficient against it? No, you can't. You can't even stop them from, cheating taxes inside of the EU, as it turns out in recent times. So actually, Brussels has too little power rather than too much power. I'm not advocating a full federalization, obviously, of everything to the Brussels level. I agree there are very relevant issues at the local or regional level as well. But for the moment, the reason why the EU is not efficient is mostly because it doesn't have the competencies.
Well, Dr. Pogatsa, I think you've really lit a fire in our audience because the vote is in and we have a new shift in what the votes are in. So, Dr. Engels, you are right now sitting at 56%, and Dr. Pogatsa, you've shifted down to 44%. So pull it back, man. Well, let's do this. So you're talking about a foreign policy for the EU. Does it make any sense for the EU to have a common military, for example? Dr. Engels?
Yes, most certainly. I'm very strongly in favor of a strong Europe. I totally agree with the fact that it is a shame to see that Europe now is becoming a second or third rate area in the world, whereas China, for example, is leading, whereas we see this very astonishing rise of India, of Brazil, for example. We have this very dangerous fragmentation also of the Muslim world on the one side. And what is Europe doing? Nothing more or less. So there isn't any foreign policy of Europe that has absolutely to change if we want to assure also our access to strategical resources, our political interests in the world, and so on. So that is very, very sure. But of course, without a common identity, without a common solidarity, without knowing what it all is about, what we mean when we speak about Europe, it will be very difficult to assure a common policy when, on the one hand, we have states which, for example, when it comes to Russia, defend a more, could say, pro-Russian or at least neutral attitude, like France, like Germany also, when you think about Nord Stream 2. And on the other hand, countries like Poland, where I'm currently living, and which does not at all follow this attitude. So what we need most is first to define what we mean when we speak about Europe and European interest, and that we dare also to say, well, we are Europeans, we have our place in the world, we have our specific interest. We are a proper civilization. We are not just one step to a world state where everyone is basically the same and where cultural differences are only folkloristic or culinary. We have our very specific view of humanity, and we first have to assert that, to find a common ground between the European nations before being able to set up the outlines of a common military and foreign policy. That's the big issue. I don't think we can have that very simply just by discussing. We need, I think, to go through a strong common experience of shared solidarity and of shared problems. And I think that history is, unfortunately, preparing just such a period of decline and unrest to us in the next 10, 20 years.
Interesting. Dr. Pogatsa, before you respond, I just want to ask the audience, if you have any questions for Dr. Engels or Dr. Pogatsa, please make sure that you write them in the comments, and I will ask them live. I know that this is a really hot button issue. We want to make sure that we're getting the answers that you're looking for. So, Dr. Pogatsa, about this shared identity and shared solidarity of what it means to be European. What do you have to say about that?
Right. I actually agree that we should define what it means to be European. But I also think that over the last couple of decades, we've pretty much done that. I think you know what it means to be European. Europe defines itself as a zone of democracy, human rights, the social model, also a zone of environmental sustainability. These are all issues that we have highlighted over the decades. It's in the founding documents. It's as declarations. They actually exist in the treaties. My problem is that it's actually, we're not walking the walk. We're just talking the talk. It's not actually reinforced by capacities and by competencies. So we do know what we want to project into the world. We want to be projecting these issues. What we're not at the moment, and that's the real problem. As far as militarism is concerned, as far as the army is concerned, at the risk of sounding incredibly naive and at the risk of losing all the votes in this debate, I'm going to say that I would go for completely abolishing the military. I think not only should the European Union not have a common military, but we as European states should move towards gradually abolishing our militaries and showing an example to an increasingly militarizing world. I mean, countries all over the world are militarizing very fast. And what are we doing? We're actually exporting war to countries, especially in the Middle East. It's European countries that are exporting weapons to countries from where the refugees are coming to Europe. Right. We shouldn't be surprised that there are people coming from the Middle East to Europe in millions if we are exporting from Germany, from the UK, from Italy, from France. We're exporting arms, and we shouldn't be. Now, I know the argument that if we don't export, somebody else will. But I don't agree with that on that reading of the world. I mean, if I'm pushing drugs in front of a school, is it an argument to stay there, to push drugs in front of a school, just because I can claim that somebody else would if I wasn't? I mean, obviously some other pusher would appear and push drugs in front of the school, but is that a reason for me to stay? No, I think that Europeans should slowly abolish the military and show an example of a peaceful world. We're not going to protect ourselves with a peaceful military. I mean, you shouldn't have the illusion that in the 21st century, we're going to fight wars with tanks and guns and stuff like that. 21st century warfare is completely different.
Right. Dr. Pogatsa, I'm sorry, I do have to interrupt you. We're running out of time, and we have some questions. I want to get them out. So we have one from Dorothea Gal. Good morning, Dorothea. She asks, I wonder how is it even possible to imagine a union between European countries which have always fought with each other, have all different understandings of history, and are still carrying the burden of unjust decisions. Wow, that's a big one. Dr. Engels, do you have a response?
Yes, sure, but I first wish to respond to the military issue. I think, at least from a historian's point of view, the idea of abolishing one's military in order to set example for the rest is probably the most suicidal idea I've ever heard in the last years. So, but that's my point of view, of course, as a historian, perhaps as a somewhat cynical pragmatist. When it comes to the question about European countries and their identity, well, we did that. That's a narrative which is absolutely wrong. Europe has in its history always been strongly united. Think only about the Middle Ages, where you had the Sacrum Imperium in the middle of Europe, where Europe was so united around Christianity, about the allegiance to the emperor, to the Pope, for example. Think also about ulterior phases, where we all fought the same fights. It was not always nation against nation. It was Protestantism against Catholicism, for example, everywhere. It was modernism against traditionalism. So we have shared a common history for at least 1,200 years everywhere in Europe. Go in a museum, compare a museum in Lisbon to a museum in Warsaw, you will find exactly the same artist and somewhat the same evolutions. There is a common European identity. It is there in our history. Fights and wars are parts of this, but we have much in common, and it is absolutely possible to reinforce this European identity which exists and which nobody, at least two generations ago, even in the middle of many wars between Europeans, would have put this into question. That's very new only. It's only a thing of the last generation that we start to wonder if there is an identity. No one would have put that in question the last 1,000 years.
Dr. Pogatsa, a different question for you. This comes from Edouard Zambo. Good morning, Edouard. So, who is the most competent leader in the EU, and is there a crisis in political leadership?
Oh, I actually think there's a gigantic crisis in European leadership. I think that the last generation of great leaders actually were present around the early 90s. And ever since then, all you hear is proclamations. So you hear, every other day you hear a huge proclamation from Macron or somebody else about the future of Europe, which never ever comes true. I mean, nothing ever materializes of this. I don't even listen to these people anymore, because whatever they say, it's very disconnected from reality.
Right. It's completely unhinged. Is your point? So let's check in one last time with the vote before we let you go, gentlemen. So Dr. Engels, you are sitting pretty at 55%. Dr. Pogatsa, you unfortunately are at 45%. Gentlemen, I really want to thank you for your time. This was a lively debate, great, energetic way to start the day, and I appreciate your time. Audience, thank you for participating, and stay tuned to find out what Central Europe's chances are in the continent. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. I've been Sid Murthy.
Thank you very much.